Hello, everyone. This is going to be Chapter 9, Part 1 of the Market Revolution. And we're going to start with a 9.1 primary source from Alexis de Tocqueville, a French admirer of the United States, but also occasionally a bit of a critic, I think, who says, as one digs deeper into the national character of the Americans, one sees that they have sought the value of everything in this world only in the answer to this single question: how much money will it bring in? Maybe a bit of a backhanded compliment, perhaps? Who knows? Anyway, from the 1820s through the 1850s, we see America expanding and continuing to expand west, but it did so with a new goal. We were moving away from the agrarian system, the Jeffersonian yeoman farmer idea, where every farmer would be self sufficient, not have to worry about buying anything. They had enough food to provide for themselves. And we started moving towards a system of cash and selling products and creating a steady market for American goods. This is known as a market revolution. And it's tied in with many other revolutions of the early 1800s, including revolutions in technology, revolutions relating to travel and communication, and also just the westward movement of Americans. We're also going to see later on in Chapter 10 that it also relates to the idea that Americans are becoming more democratic, small d democratic, the idea that Americans want to become more involved in the political system. In this chapter, we'll take a look at the Western movement of America and revolutions in technology and communications. So let's start with the new economy. Up until the War of 1812, most of American life had remained more or less as it had been before the American Revolution. You probably did not go very far away from your house. Travel was so slow, most trade was between people who knew each other, and rural farmers would grow enough crops to survive and maybe enough to trade for barter in town if they needed to. Most artisans and craftsmen were doing homespun goods. They did their things slowly over time, creating one thing at a time very slowly. It would take days or even weeks, especially for some of the finer goods. Eventually, though, in the mid to late 1800s, I'm sorry, the early to mid 1800s, new advances in technology would change this. So we see early advances in technology, first relating to travel in the early 1800s. They helped to link rural farmers that were living in the West on the frontier to the cities in the East and eventually to the rest of the world. The first big innovation are roads, well maintained, paved, crushed gravel roads. They were built and funded by cities, by states, and even by the national government, with the idea that they would be funded, the upkeep of them would be funded by forcing people to pay tolls on these roads. These were called turnpikes. In 1806, the U.S. government created one called the National Road that eventually went all the way from Baltimore to Vandalia, Illinois, with plans for it to go to St. Louis, although it never quite made it that far. This offered a more safe, secure, reliable roadway for people to travel and trade on. So here's the National Road as far as it got in 1850 to Vandalia in Missouri. I'm sorry, Vandalia, Illinois. However, these roads were very tough to maintain, especially because travelers would avoid the tolls basically by using side roads once they got to a toll booth. And so it was very tough to keep up the maintaining of them because they weren't getting enough money in. So people instead used water to move most of their goods around the United States. By 1807, we had created the steamboat. Robert Fulton, an American, introduced America to his first steamboat. And these steam powered ships could travel both up and down rivers, both with and against the current, which used to be impossible. You couldn't take a sailboat against the current was moving too quickly. And so this cut down on travel times by weeks. By the 1830s, there were hundreds of steamboats on rivers and lakes and oceans and canals all over America. Now, one of the biggest canals was the Erie Canal. Canals, by the way, if you have forgotten World Studies 1 or 2, is a man made waterway that connects two larger bodies of water. Usually they were maybe 30 ish miles long at the maximum. However, the Erie Canal was much bigger. It was the brainchild of the governor of New York, DeWitt Clinton, from the powerful New York Clinton family. and it traveled from Lake Erie in upstate New York through upstate New York all the way to the Hudson River, and the Hudson River connected with New York City and with Hudson Bay and meant that it could connect with the Atlantic Ocean. It traveled for 363 miles, a huge route at that time. And just like we're going to see with trains, cities popped up along the way where the canal went. So places like Buffalo, Rochester, New York, and it also connected western farms into eastern markets. And it helped to begin this sort of fad of creating canals during this time. Other states trying to match the success of New York. We'll see this come to a stop mainly with the creation of the railroads, though. So here in the upper right-hand side of Lake Erie, we see the Erie Canal going from Buffalo to Albany and then down the Hudson River to New York City. And we also see there's another canal, the Ohio and Erie, starting in Cleveland and heading down to Cincinnati. So this, by the way, is the series of roads and rivers that connected America at this time. So you see we had many roads that were being formed during this time. Now, the canals open up the waterway, however, the railroads open up the land. America's first railroad, called the Baltimore and Ohio, began in 1828. By 1860, there were over 30,000 miles of railroads in America. And they had the same benefit of canals, that they saved times and connected our nation, but they weren't married to these larger water sources. They could travel over land, and therefore people had more freedom to move wherever they wanted to with railroads. So here is the growth of railroads in the 1840s and 50s. You can see it getting much bigger. By the 1880s, by early 1900s, they're everywhere. Now, at the same time as railroads are increasing the speed of transportation, we're also seeing an increase in the speed of communication technology with the telegraph. The telegraph was invented by a painter and inventor named Samuel F.B. Morse. And the telegraph basically uses wires to connect places, and you can transmit electronic bursts of sound, sort of these bzzzt sound over long distances. They had not yet discovered how to transmit voices over telephone wires, but that would come soon. It used what's called Morse code to represent letters and numbers. And by the 1840s, there were 50,000 miles of telegraph wires connecting the nation. So here is Samuel F.B. Morse, by the way. He is born in 1791, died in 1872 from Massachusetts. He is an inventor and a painter. He did that self-portrait over there in 1812. And his first transmission by telegraph, he telegraphed to his friend, "What hath God wrought?" which is a biblical way of saying, "Isn't this cool?" So this is the Morse key and sounder. You tap that, and it created the bzzzt sound that traveled down the telegraph wire. And this is what Morse code looks like. We'll talk about this a bit more in your homework, but you should be able to see that the more frequently used numbers and letters are easier to send and to transmit. That was on purpose. Now, these new inventions and innovations in transportation and communication helped open up the American West. And by the way, the American West at this time ended at the Mississippi River, more or less, legally at least. After the War of 1812, we see millions of Americans heading west across the Appalachian Mountains. And this influx of new citizens led to a large increase in states. From 1812 to 1821, we have 6 new states enter the Union, most of them in the West, although Maine also enters. We'll talk about that later with the Missouri Compromise. Often these new arrivals to the West moved in groups through the mountains and into the Midwest. So some of them moved to established cities, some of them helped establish their own cities, some bought land, and some basically just settled onto land that nobody had claimed. This is what we call a squatter, living on a land with no legal title. Now, as our population continued to move, America also continued to expand. We started to force more Native Americans off of their land, and even some Americans would settle on land that was not owned by America. They settled in Spanish territory, Mexican territory, British territory, thinking that eventually it would become ours. And we'll see this more in 9.2 with the idea of manifest destiny, that eventually it was God's desire that we would overspread this land, as they put it. In 1819, after attempts to buy or even take Florida by force, America eventually paid Spain to take control of Florida in what is known as the Adams-Onis Treaty, negotiated by John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State and future President of the United States. As the population increased, so did the power of the United States. And many new American leaders are from this powerful new Western territory. I'm thinking of guys like Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, many of them from the Deep South or from the West. So here we see the new populations. We see that New York has a large population, but we see new places like Cincinnati, Louisville, St. Louis, Pittsburgh that are starting to become new and powerful and big. Now, let's look at the Deep South. We're talking like Alabama, Mississippi, that area. As the West continued to grow, we also see that cotton production is beginning to grow, creating what is known as the Cotton Kingdom of the Deep South. Now, demand for cotton was very high, but at first, it's very hard to make cotton or to make fiber out of cotton. You basically have to pick the cotton, and then you have to pick the seeds out of the fluff, which takes hours and is very painful and very hard to do. That changed in 1793 with Eli Whitney and his invention of the cotton gin. This is a simple device, seemingly simple, that removed seeds from cotton. However, it made all the difference when it came to cotton production. So this is what cotton fluff looks like with the seeds inside. It would take a person a couple hours to make a pound of cotton by picking out the seeds by hand. But with this new invention, the cotton gin, it happened very quickly, and the amount of cotton that could be produced increased exponentially during this time. And here's Eli Whitney, 1765 to 1825, from Massachusetts. He was an inventor and an entrepreneur. He's a northerner, too. He went to Yale. Probably best known for the cotton gin, but also for something that we'll see in a little bit, which is interchangeable parts. Allegedly, according to some historians, he hoped that the cotton gin would decrease the need for slaves. However, it did the very opposite. The cotton gin caused a spike in slavery, and it created a growth of enslaved land in the Deep South. Southern slave owners pushed out the small farmers who didn't own enslaved people, basically told them to move to the hills where there was not good cotton farming land, and they kind of eked out a living in the hills. Much of the Deep South was converted into cotton plantations, large farms owned by one family that produced nothing but cotton. After Congress banned the import of enslaved people from Africa in 1808, the slave trade started to move people from the Mid-South, Kentucky, places like that, into the Deep South, and this supplied the labor for what was called the Cotton Kingdom. And so here we can see the growth of these large cotton fields and cotton plantations throughout Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, the Deep South growing cotton at a huge rate. Now, historians estimate that about 1 million enslaved people were moved from the Deep South, from the Mid-South to the Deep South in between 1800 and 1860. Trading enslaved people at this time to places like Alabama and Mississippi was very lucrative. You could make a lot of money off of it. However, for the enslaved people, it was a terrible thing to have to do. Often they were walked from places like Virginia to places like Alabama, chained together by the hundreds. In 1793, the United States created about 5 million pounds of cotton a year. By 1820, it created almost 170 million pounds of cotton. So this was a very lucrative but very horrible business of enslaved people creating all this cotton. And we see it even in our terminology. So this is a slave auction from 1842. Today, when we talk about being sold down the river, we often use it as a colloquialism for being betrayed. However, back then, being sold down the river meant that you were sold into slavery in the Deep South, and it could be seen as a death sentence. You could be torn away from your family if you were an enslaved person during that time. Now, let's look at the market society. While the South was mostly rural, mostly farming due to the demand for cotton, the same could not be said for the rest of the Midwest. So we start to see the growth of cities along the rivers and along the lakes and along the waterways and along the railroads. And the market revolution drove them to become cities of trade and industry, industrial cities. Now, during this time, we saw a movement away from the way that farmers used to live. I mentioned this before, that they're no longer the yeoman farmers of the Jeffersonian dream, that they were self-sustaining, growing enough food to feed themselves, not caring about the rest of the world, untouched by the rest of America. Instead, they were growing huge amounts of goods to sell to people in the big cities. Beyond the big cities, they were buying their farms with loans from banks in the big cities in the east. They bought new machinery to help speed up and industrialize farming so they could create giant farms based on cash crops. This was no longer the Jeffersonian yeoman farmer. So, for instance, there was the steel plow. This cut through soil more easily. This was invented by John Deere in 1833, which is why we have John Deere tractors today. This is the mechanical reaper, invented in 1831 by Cyrus McCormick. It was pulled by horses, and the reaper could cut many grain stalks at one time, and collect them very easily. So this is a lot faster than having, 5 guys with scythes trying to cut down the grain stalks. Now, Western expansion also created a desire for bigger cities in the Midwest. We start to see places like Cincinnati and St. Louis. Cincinnati was the pork capital of the Americas. St. Louis was an important port city along the Mississippi River. We also see Louisville, Kentucky, and especially Chicago. This is the time when Chicago starts to boom, although there was a bit of a competition, he said, realizing that his St. Louis pride is showing, where Chicago and St. Louis were sort of fighting over who was going to be the biggest city in the Midwest, and eventually Chicago won out. Cheaters. Anyway, so the sites along the rivers and the lakes of the Midwest were important for shipping. By 1860, Chicago had actually become America's fourth biggest city, and you know what? Good for them. So here is St. Louis in 1859. Man, I am really apparently very St. Louis biased in this. These new cities also changed the way people worked, though. So before, one person would spend maybe days or weeks crafting artisan type goods. Now, the best artisans were put into factories and they created things bit by bit. So one artisan would create one piece of a shoe or one piece of furniture, and then somebody else would create another, and by the end of it, you would have a shoe. This would later be improved by Henry Ford in the assembly line. Now, factories. The factory system was created in England in the British Industrial Revolution, and it moved to America in the 1790s with a guy named Samuel Slater. He was a British immigrant who snuck over to America having memorized the factory plans that he saw in England, and he used them to create a textile mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, which is seen as the beginning of the American Industrial Revolution. His factory produced yarn, and then he shipped yarn off to people who lived around the factory, and they basically turned the yarn into textiles in their homes. Eventually, this would become more centralized, with the factory doing all the work in-house. So here's Samuel Slater, who said, "I flatter myself that I can give the greatest satisfaction in making machinery, making good yarn, either for stockings or twist, as any that is made in England." Now, the War of 1812 and the Embargo Acts of Jefferson had made it so that American goods were actually in very high demand because it was hard to get anything else. Very quickly, these factories began to appear all throughout the American Northeast, in Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, in Connecticut, usually around rivers, because most of these factories had mills, and the water from the rivers would push the mills in order to turn the yarn. One of the biggest ones was an entire town that was devoted to the factory that was built there, the town of Lowell, Massachusetts, invented by a guy named Lowell. So it would become the first of many factory towns. By 1850, we had over 10,000 people employed in Lowell mills around the American Northeast. So this is what a Lowell mill looked like in 1850. I think Lowell, one of the two. So one of the most important innovations that helped create the American system in manufactures was interchangeable parts, also from Eli Whitney, along with the cotton gin, where you would have a mold that would create the same part over and over again. It took the randomness out of creating goods. However, it also took sort of the homespun touch out of creating a lot of goods, but many people were willing to give that up for a you know if one part broke in your rifle, that's what Eli Whitney did first is guns. If one part broke in your gun, you could replace the part. You wouldn't have to replace the whole gun. Further west, in places like Cincinnati, we still see that this work is being done on a smaller scale in smaller factories, not in the big mills of the Northeast. Now, factory life really changed how people lived too. On the farm, people would get up with the sun; they would go to sleep when the sun left. In factories, though, you had to follow the alarms and the clocks. The scheduled arrival of trains meant that the whole getting up with the sun thing didn't really work anymore. And obeying the clock was seen by some as sort of going against American freedom. The idea that, Americans should have the right to kind of get up whenever we want to. Think about that, all of us who go to school and wait for the alarm to go off at 7:50 in the morning. But many factory workers were newly arrived immigrants because a lot of Americans thought that factory work was kind of beneath them a little bit. Though we did see that the mills actually employed many American women. Um, Many northeastern factories were completely worked by young women and by child labor. Lowell Mills convinced families to let their daughters move into these factory towns, and they did so by setting up women's only boarding houses that had supervision and strict rules about, men were not allowed to enter, obviously. They also put in churches and lecture halls to educate and civilize what are known as the Lowell girls. Or Lowell, I don't know. Factory work was also seen as not an end for these young women, but sort of a stop along the path you get a little money, it'll help you get a dowry, it'll help you get married later on. So here's some of the Lowell girls, wow, that's getting harder to say, working on one of these mills in the 1800s. Now, while this is seen as very restrictive, it was actually kind of empowering for women of the time. It meant that they could get a little money that was theirs, not their families necessarily. And it was a chance to see somewhere that wasn't the farm. However, as we see immigration grow in the 1840s and 50s, the number of mill girls would decrease from the farms, and they were replaced by mainly Irish immigrants to America. Speaking of immigration, from 1790 to 1830, immigration was very slow, and mainly it was British people coming over, with a couple others like Scandinavians, maybe a few French. However, from 1840 to 1860, over 4 million immigrants arrived in America, and many of them were from Ireland and from Germany. And they settled mainly in the Northeast, New York City, Boston, places like that. However, some moved to places like St. Louis, New Orleans. What I am saying is that not a lot moved to the American South. The American South basically didn't need immigrant labor because they had the labor of enslaved people. By 1860, about one-third of New York City were first-generation Irish and German immigrants. They moved here for a lot of reasons. First of all, the Industrial Revolution caused a dip in the demand for farmers and in indentured servants. New technology like the steamship made the trip easier, so people were more likely to come over. And often immigrants were young men who traveled to America to work by themselves for a little bit, save up some money, and then send the money back to their families so their families could come over. Now, some immigrants to America were also lured by this sort of desire for freedom. However, many, it was just a question of survival. The Irish potato famine was one of the main reasons, what we would call a push factor, pushing people out of Ireland, and a pull factor of pulling them into America was that we had food here. The potato famine was a blight that killed nearly 1 million Irish people, and so caused a huge influx of Irish immigrants to America. Irish men found work as manual laborers. They built the railroads. I'm thinking of that song Paddy on the Railway by the Pogues. They worked as longshoremen. They worked in factories. Some women worked as servants, although being a servant was very difficult because you're basically on call 24/7. So a lot of these women worked in factories too. So here is a scene from the Irish potato famine. It was a horrible thing to starve to death. Now, most Irish immigrants did stay in big cities like New York and Boston, although some did move to St. Louis. St. Louis did have a sizable Irish population. The next biggest group were the Germans, although Germany was not a country yet, they came from the German principalities. Many were skilled craftsmen, and when they settled in sort of German towns. Some also moved west. They moved to places like Milwaukee, Cincinnati, St. Louis, of course. They established German speaking schools known as kindergartens. They had German shops, German churches, where they could hear Mass spoken in German. They also had German speaking newspapers. So, one example of this is Adolphus Busch, who immigrated to St. Louis in 1857. He was born in 1839. He was the co founder of the Anheuser-Busch Brewing Company in St. Louis with his father in law, Eberhard Anheuser, and he was not the only German immigrant to come over to St. Louis and start making beer. You can still find him, by the way, in Bellefontaine Cemetery in St. Louis up through today. This, by the way, is the building of the Anzeiger des Westens, which was founded in 1835. One of the biggest German language newspapers in the Midwest, and here in St. Louis. I don't think that building still exists anymore. Now, these new immigrants to America were not greeted with open arms. There was sort of this constant question of, like, who is an American and where should we allow immigration from? These new immigrants were viewed with suspicion by the British immigrants to America who had arrived before them. Many Protestants were still very prejudiced against Catholics, and so a lot of these guys were Catholic. Irish immigrants in the Northeast also very quickly were becoming interested in politics, and so they could sway elections, which worried some of the older school British oldcomers to America. This also helped to call for a restriction of immigration from certain areas within Europe, although it would take a while to get there. We see a help wanted, no Irish need apply sign. This is actually from the early 1900s, but that happened in the 1800s as well. Americans who did not want new immigrants to come over or who feared this new wave of immigrants called themselves nativists. Which is kind of ironic considering that they were immigrants from the last generation of immigrants who came over. They generally tended to stereotype Irish immigrants as corrupt, politically criminals. They were, drinking and using drugs, but also stealing American jobs. That they would basically undercut Americans and do their jobs at a much cheaper price. And this nativism would eventually become a political movement in the 1850s with what's called the American or Know Nothing Party. But even in the 1830s and 40s, we see anti-immigrant riots and a lot of anti-immigrant hysteria and just prejudice among many people. This helped to get a nativist elected mayor of New York in 1844. So here's an anti-immigrant political cartoon with an Irishman and German guy stealing the ballot box during an election. Now, we also see that the market revolution changed how businesses were treated by local and national governments and how the law treated them, too. So a lot of these businesses would get charters. Basically, they got a special written document from the U.S. government that said if the corporation failed, the people who put their money in, the big businessmen, would not fail. They would not be held liable for the failure of the company. However, if a small mom and pop shop failed, then it would take the family under with it. We see that also the government gave special privileges to some of these big corporations, and these were defended in court. So Dartmouth v. Woodward said that charters could not be altered or revoked by the government. Sorry, almost there. We also see Gibbons v. Ogden stopped the government from supporting monopolies. This is going to be a big thing later on in the 1800s. The courts also generally sided with corporations against workers. So, if workers wanted to organize or unionize for better pay or better working conditions, the courts would often say that they were working illegally as a conspiracy. So, this would be going on until I believe the 1840s was the first time it was ruled that workers were allowed to organize.